Our story begins and began here, in the house of Beethoven's parents. Beethoven was always sure of his worth, but only a madman can ever feel sure of his own immortality. "Applaud, friends, the play's over," declared Beethoven as he signed his last will and testament. Well, actually, the play was never over. It was applauded not only by friends, but also by total strangers, those from over a century later who knew him only through records and concerts. And today his music is learned, hummed, performed, recorded, and known more than that of any other composer. It has been used by resistance movements as a call to arms during the last war, and by governments as an anthem. The music has far outlived the man. The spirit has outlived the flesh.
Presentation of this program is made possible by grants from the Child's Foundation, which asks that you join them in supporting public broadcasting, and by AAL, a fraternal benefits society based in Appleton, Wisconsin, providing more than 1.4 million members nationwide with fraternal benefits and volunteer opportunities. Additional funding is provided by Lufthansa, the German airline, and by Volkswagen, one of the world's leading automotive companies.
Now, what is left in this attractive, if wayward home? Not much more than the walls. And, of course, memories. The organ from the local church which Beethoven played as a youth. The forte piano which his fingers touched. Glasses, seals for letters. There are stairs on which he must have fallen and hurt his knees, like all small boys. Corridors in which he must have yelled his exuberance, only to be told to keep quiet. Someone was always trying to sleep. And the little garden where on fine days he learned the first joys of meditation. He was born in this house in Bonn in 1770, the descendant of 2 generations of court musicians. No one knows the exact date of his birth, but records show that he was baptized on December the 17th. Now, in those days, most of Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire, but as Voltaire said, this empire was neither Holy Roman nor even an empire. Rather was it a loose confederation of more than 100 small states ruled by nobles, electors, and archbishops, who often governed as absolute monarchs, each with his own opera house, his few soldiers, and his palace. Bonn was among the most enlightened centers in Germany. In fact, the Pope even complained that it was a contaminated seat of learning. Bonn was a town that boasted a lively theater, an intense musical life. And in the absence of cohesive power all over Germany, political ambitions were channeled into cultural activities. Beethoven would have had a pleasant childhood if it hadn't been for his somewhat heavy-handed father. At the first manifestation of the boy's talent, Herr van Beethoven hastened to follow the example of another ambitious father, Leopold Mozart. Ludwig was forced to practice long hours at the piano. His father then presented him to the public, claiming that the boy was 2 years younger than he really was. The intention was obvious. Well, Beethoven's gift found recognition, but fame did not follow instantly. In the absence of immediate success, the father loosened his grip, and it was Beethoven's great fortune to be entrusted to a new teacher called Neefe, who quickly recognized the boy's genius. Neefe opened his young pupil's mind to the philosophies and aesthetics of the Age of Enlightenment and to the moral nature of art. He taught him Bach's well-tempered clavier. Beethoven studied the violin and the viola. His organ playing was so good that at the age of only 11 he was engaged as Neefe's assistant. Yes, Neefe was not only his master but also court organist. And it was Neefe who gave Beethoven the motto that would guide him throughout his life. Music is the language of the heart of man. At the age of 16, Beethoven made his way to Vienna to play for Mozart. And legend tells us that at first Mozart simply shook his head. He assumed that here was yet another well-rehearsed performer. But when Beethoven began to improvise, Mozart became excited. Oh, this lad will be talked about. You keep an eye on him. But unfortunately, the paths of these two musical giants crossed only very briefly, because Beethoven was called back here to Bonn, to the bedside of his dying mother. His mother's death was a great loss to him, as he had dearly loved this simple, gentle, warm-hearted woman. And many years later, he would confide that he mourned the death of just two people, his mother and himself. With the death of his mother, the family began to disintegrate. The father, who was beset by failure, suffered from alcoholism and tuberculosis. The two younger brothers were without guidance. And so when he was only 18, Beethoven was made legal guardian of his family. However, his life was far from bleak. He earned his living as an orchestral musician and cultivated a wide circle of friends, some of them for life. Fellow musicians admired him, and he was popular with the local aristocrats, who eventually gathered together sufficient money for his inevitable move to Europe's musical capital, Vienna. Now that Mozart is dead, go to Vienna. His patron and friend, Count Waldstein, said, go to Vienna to receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. But it was not only Haydn who was to become one of Beethoven's teachers in Vienna, but also Salieri, much admired by Beethoven for his artistry and generosity, a welcome refutation of a more recent interpretation by poets and playwrights who never knew him. Beethoven was 22 years old when he arrived in Vienna. Not only was he relatively unknown, but his financial means were limited. However, young Herr van Beethoven had one asset, his skill at the piano. But Vienna at that time was the home of some 300 professional pianists and at least 6,000 piano students. Competition was fierce. Each clique of music lovers championed its own favorite. But it was not long before Beethoven established his supremacy. He must be in league with the devil, said one of his rivals. In Beethoven's playing, the weight of the idea was as pronounced as his virtuosity. He despised those who treated the piano as if it was a recumbent harp performing finger dances on the keyboard. His advice was simply, press your fingers down, avoid unnecessary motion, and then sing. At the beginning of his performances, Beethoven used to strike the keys with the palm of his hand or run his fingers in a quick glissando over the piano. He loved good-natured nonsense, and his theatrics in the court salon only enhanced his standing with the aristocrats of Vienna, whose favorite pastime was music. Some of them were even themselves excellent performers. And whenever a promising new talent appeared on the musical horizon, a great competition ensued over who would become his patron. You see, many musicians were even employed by nobility on a permanent basis, both to compose and to perform. For instance, the celebrated Haydn. In Beethoven's time, aristocrats regarded the musicians they employed as members of a household. In old ledgers, their pay was lumped together with that of other domestic staff. But a life of subservience was not for Beethoven. He once walked out of a party because he was not seated at his host's table. The host was, of course, a nobleman. He declared to another princeling, with all due respect, Your Honor, I do not choose to observe the rules and regulations of your court. For some in society, Beethoven's behavior was boorish. For more enlightened natures, it was evidence of his democratic spirit, inspired by the events of the French Revolution in 1789. At this stage, his compositions still had their roots in tradition, but even so, they manifested his impatience with accepted ways. Right and wrong? Who is there to decide what is allowed and what is forbidden? At the age of 30, Beethoven was a celebrity as a pianist and as a composer. He was socially accepted, financially solvent. He was even the owner of a horse. At the beginning of the 19th century, public concerts were rare, and when they did take place, they were mostly devoted to charity, often to benefit the performer himself. Naturally, the artist pulled out all the stops on such rare occasions, and in 1800, Beethoven held his first concert of this sort. Not only did he conduct works by Mozart and Haydn, as well as his own first symphony, he also introduced his new septet, played a piano concerto of his, and improvised on the piano quite a full evening. And he even sold the tickets himself. But as most concert activities still took place in the elegant homes of Vienna's aristocracy, social and musical life were inseparable. And Beethoven enjoyed both. Imagine then his feelings of horror when, having found success, he began to lose his hearing. "Oh, you men who think that I am malevolent," he wrote, "stubborn or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. How can I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others, a sense which I once possessed, in the highest perfection? My misfortune is doubly painful to me because I am bound to be misunderstood. For me, there can be no relaxation in the company of my fellow men, no refined conversation, no mutual exchanges of ideas. I must live almost alone, like one who has been banished. Any more, and I would have ended my life. Only my art held me back." It was actually to be a long time before Beethoven's worst fears were confirmed. His hearing deteriorated slowly, and it was to be some 14 years before he was completely, irretrievably deaf. This growing menace made him clear his decks for action, counterattack the menace with extraordinary resilience, by plunging into a world of daring new sounds with a boldness and intensity never heard before. If Beethoven's early works were a farewell to the 18th century, he greeted the 19th century by stretching existing forms to the limit, and with them, the virtuosity, creating new colors, new dimensions. But the innovations extended also into reflective moods, into introspection, intimacy. His sonatas for cello and piano allowed the rich sonorities of the cello to be savored in extended introductions. Beethoven liked this particular viola well enough to put his seal on it. He owned numerous stringed instruments and at least 4 pianos. Beethoven was irritated by the limitations of the pianos that were available in his time, but nonetheless no instrument inspired him more. His progress in the art of composition can best be followed in his 32 piano sonatas. They trace the development from the traditional to the visionary, from the down-to-earth to the metaphysical. Each of Beethoven's new works was different. He never repeated a recognizable pattern. The vision of each was separate, distinct. He carried with him a notebook in which the nucleus of every new musical idea was sketched. Then ideas matured in his mind. They were mentally trimmed, shaped, honed, and only when he was ready did he harvest the result by committing it to paper. Despite the newness of his musical language, Beethoven was spared the indifference and even the hostility of the musical public. Perhaps his voice was too compelling, too irrefutable to be rejected. Or whatever the reason, the fact was that although his music was frequently misunderstood, it was nevertheless as frequently acclaimed. He was, in a sense, the spokesman of his times. His outspokenness and powerfully held beliefs were in tune with the world of youth, born to the sounds of the French Revolution and the American Declaration of Independence. And with this brashness went a degree of buoyant optimism, despite, perhaps because of, adversity. To quote Voltaire, "Someday all will be well." Still, Beethoven was basically mistrustful of power in the hands of the people. He felt that power should always be associated with wisdom, a rare commodity confined by definition to the wise. However, the concept of fraternity and of liberty uplifted him. "Peace and liberty are the most precious of all conditions," he cried, and went on, "Man is blessed with a spark of divinity. He deserves to be free."
The Immortal Beethoven with Peter Ustinov will continue following station identification.
For Columbus and WPBO TV 42 Portsmouth.
Presentation of this program is made possible by grants from AAL, a fraternal benefits society based in Appleton, Wisconsin, providing more than 1.4 million members nationwide with fraternal benefits and volunteer opportunities, and by the Child's Foundation, which asks that you join them in supporting public broadcasting. Additional funding is provided by Volkswagen, one of the world's leading automotive companies, and Lufthansa, the German airline.
Idealism was soon dealt a first blow. Napoleon Bonaparte, virtual leader of France after the Revolution, the great hope of democratic values all over Europe, suddenly surrendered to vainglory and crowned himself emperor. Beethoven, who had dedicated the Eroica Symphony to his hero, tore up the dedication and substituted the words, "in memory of a great man." As an insult to a living person, even Beethoven could not have gone much further than that. He too will become a tyrant who gratifies only his own ambitions, Beethoven said. And as though he had overheard the remark, Napoleon proceeded to do just that, plunging Europe into 2 decades of ugly and wasteful war. Frustrated, Beethoven growled, "It's a pity I do not understand the art of war as I do the art of music. I'd conquer him." The opera Fidelio is the story of a faithful woman, Leonore, who, disguised as a man, finds employment in a prison to save her husband, Florestan, a captive there. The opera Fidelio is an impassioned outcry against tyranny and a paean to the simple virtues of humanity which attain heroic proportions.
Und ist nicht mein Grab ihre Hölle. Ich seh wie ein Engel im rosigen Duft sich tröstend zur Seite mich stellet. Ein Engel Leonoren, der Gattin zugleich, der führt mich der Freiheit ins himmlische Reich. Und spürt nicht blinden, auf säuselnde Luft. Ich seh wie ein Engel im rosigen Duft, ein Engel sich tröstend zur Seite mich stellet. Ein Engel Leonoren, der Gattin zugleich, der wird mit zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, der wird mit zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, zur Freiheit, ins himmlische Reich, ins himmlische Reich, ins himmlische Reich.
Fidelio was first performed in 1805 to an audience consisting mainly of French soldiers of the Army of Occupation, for whom the calls to justice and freedom seemed rather obscure. Only several years later did the work meet with the kind of success that it has known ever since. Could a man love a woman who was anything less than a Leonora? For Beethoven, at least in his mind, a woman should be without blemish, beautiful, talented, above all perhaps gentle, and the ideal relationship should be perfect harmony, both spiritual and physical. He appeared to be in love quite often, but never for long, as though every relationship were predestined to fail, killed by his own impossibly high standards. He was not handsome or obviously attractive. His face was pockmarked, his hands hirsute, his manners were awkward. And yet women enjoyed his company. Some even found him fascinating. When he was 42, he fell in love, not for the first time, but certainly very seriously. And 3 letters were found in a secret compartment in a box after his death. It's not clear if they were ever sent or whether they were sent back unopened. They are known as the letters to the immortal beloved. Can our love endure except through sacrifice? Can you change the fact that you are not wholly mine? Love demands everything. If only you do not forget that I must live for me and for you. Oh, you're suffering. Wherever I am, there you are too. My thoughts go out to you, my immortal beloved. Letters to the immortal beloved. Who were they addressed to? Was it Countess Guicciardi, a frivolous adventuress with many liaisons to her credit? Or Teresa Malfatti, who turned him down? Or Josefina von Brunswick, who scolded him for his sexual advances? Or Doroteo von Erdmann, whose piano playing was a means of seduction? Or Antonie von Brentano, a married woman who thought Beethoven even more noble than his art, probably because the idea of unfaithfulness was repellent to him. Beethoven was fated to love the unattainable, and alone with his pride, to destroy his only chance at happiness, which probably for him would never have been happiness at all. His work was too hard and jealous a taskmistress to allow that. You can no longer be a man, accept yourself, he wrote in his diary. Beethoven found solace in nature. Nature was the only consistency. He could be sure of it. The only wisdom which is free from deception was to be found in the great out of doors. Almighty God, he cried, I am overjoyed in the forest. Every tree spreads your words. Only here can one find peace. Peace to serve him. God was in every thunderclap, in every raindrop, in every chord, in every note, in every silence. He woke at dawn, he worked till the early afternoon, 2 or 3, and then, after a heavy meal, he walked around the city, usually ending the day in one of Vienna's taverns with newspapers, wine, clay pipe, engaged in conversation with men or in banter with the servants. His high ideals of femininity hardly extended to the taverns. He also liked to bestride the countryside, reflecting on the mysteries of nature and receiving very personal messages from the intimate God of his conscience, who gradually became his only confidant in the forbidden silence which enveloped him. His fits of temper were as notorious as his subsequent remorse. It was not unusual for him to throw a plate of food at an offending servant and then to seek forgiveness with embarrassing humility. He had a profound belief in the equality of man, until someone came along who tried to treat him as an inferior. And then his fury knew no bounds, and his truculence became majestic. In other words, a man of moods, magnified by his physical disorders. A man of exquisite sensibility and of coarse puns. A man of transcendent nobility and occasional squalor. A man of unwavering constancy and sudden changes of humor. A man of deep earnestness and an unrequited tease. For his friend Kreutzer, he wrote the famous Sonata, which bears his name. Knowing that his friend could only deal with legato notes, Beethoven wrote the piece almost exclusively in short staccato notes. Kreutzer never played it, but one hopes that he enjoyed the joke as much as Beethoven did. Beethoven's concept of beauty was strictly a state of mind. He seemed to be dressed in the same shabby clothes from day to day. Whenever he did change into something fresh, it was because some thoughtful friend had laid the clothes out on his bed for him to notice. The rooms he lived in were in a state of fearful disorder, and a visiting Swiss composer was horrified to notice an object of convenience, usually in those days kept under the bed, under Beethoven's piano. It was perhaps because the state of his lodgings was more immediately shocking than the state of his wardrobe that he changed rooms quite often, sometimes even confusing his addresses. However impractical he was on a mundane level, his creative life was under the strictest control. When his friend Melzel invented the metronome round about 1810, and it hasn't changed its outer form very much since then, Beethoven was at first rather skeptical about the utility of such a stern and monotonous taskmaster. But gradually he fell under its hypnotic spell and ended up as an addict, spending time working out the precise tempi of all his past works for the benefit of future interpreters. To the news of the success of one of his symphonies in Berlin, his response was, well, naturally it was a success. They had my metronomic tempi. When his brother sent him a letter signed Johann van Beethoven, landowner, he immediately replied, signing Ludwig van Beethoven, brain owner. He was proud of his brain and avid in its use. Without much formal education, he conceived a passion for the Greeks and the Romans of antiquity and was interested in subjects as diverse as botany, science, to the wonders of a Russian Antarctic exploration conducted by Captain Bellingshausen in 1819, 20, and 21, his bedside reading. It was natural that he cultivated writers of eminence who were always eager to meet a giant in a sister art. Predominant among these were Grillparzer, the Austrian dramatist, who was to read his funeral valedictory, and the great German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe and Beethoven met at Teplitz with foreseeable results, which did nothing to change their high opinions of each other. The mundane and affable Goethe, with his mastery of protocol and nicety, remarked tactfully about Beethoven, he may not be entirely wrong in finding the world detestable, but his saying so does nothing to render it more pleasant for himself or for others. Beethoven's reaction to the meeting was less subtle, less shaded. Goethe delights excessively in the company of aristocrats. When they were walking together in a park a few days later, Goethe drew Beethoven's attention to two archdukes approaching them along the same path and suggested that they should stand aside in order to be able to bow. Beethoven pretended not to hear. He walked on, his head low in thought. The two archdukes made way for him and bowed. He ignored them, stopped and turned round in time to see Goethe bent double by the side of the road, while the archdukes walked by, oblivious of his identity. "You must realize," growled Beethoven with a twinkle, "that there are only two of us. There are thousands of them." In 1814, the Napoleonic Wars were over, except for the death rattle of Waterloo in 1815. The Congress of Vienna convened in order to fashion a new order for Europe. Beethoven wrote a potboiler entitled Wellington's Victory. It referred to the Battle of Vitoria in Spain in 1813. In fact, it might well have been called the 1813 Overture instead of a symphony, which it isn't. It was a triumph, which illustrated the degradation of artistic standards in a time of relief from the horrors of war and gaiety rediscovered. Beethoven was satisfied with his work's success, at least financially, and replied to one critic who suggested that it was unworthy of him with an imprecation so robust and so vivid that there is no place for it even on permissive television. The public wanted lightness and laughter. Basically, it always does. And the music of Rossini was now the rage in Vienna. But in any case, Beethoven had grown quite deaf. He used ear trumpets to pick up what shreds of sound he could. More isolated than ever, beset by financial worries, Beethoven faced the most difficult period of his life.
Auf dem Hügel sieht sich spähend in das blaue Nebelland. Nach den Fernen driften sehend, wo ich dich, Geliebte, fand. Von dir geschieden, tränend liegen Berg und Tal, zwischen uns und unseren Frieden, unserem Glück und unserer Qual. Ach, den Blick kannst du nicht sehen, der zu dir so glühend eilt, und die Seufzer, sie verwehen in dem Raum, der uns teilt. Will denn nichts mehr zu dir dringen, nichts der Liebe Bote sein. Singen will ich Lieder singen, die dir klagen einem Pein. Denn vor Liedes klagend weichet jeder Raum und jede Zeit, und ein liebend Herz erreichet, was ein liebend Herz gemeint. sind, weht so leise der Wind, möchte ich sein, möchte ich sein. Hin zum sinnigen Wald trägt mich Liebesgewalt in der Pein. Innere Pein. Ach, mich zögst nicht von hier, könnt ich traute bei dir ewiglich sein. Ewiglich sein. Leichte Siegler in den Höhen und du Bächlein klein und schmal, könnt mein Liebchen ihr erspähen, grüßt sie mir viel tausendmal. Seht ihr Wolken, sie dann gehen, sinnend in dem stillen Tal, lasst mein Bild vor ihren Stirn in dem luft'gen Himmelssaal. Wird sie an den Büchern stehen, die nun herzlich Fall und Tal, klagt ihr, wie mir ist geschehen, klagt ihr Vöglein meine Qual. Stille Weste bringt ihm Wehen hin zu meiner Herzenswahl, meine Säufe, die vergehen wie die Sonne letzter Strahl. Flößt ihr zu ein Liebesfliehen, lass sie Bächlein klein und schmal, treu in deinen Wogen ziehen, meine Tränen ohne Zahl, ohne Zahl. Diese Wolken in den Höhen, dieser Vöglein munterer Zug, werden dich verholt in Sehen. Nehmt mich mit im leichten Flug. Diese Wester werden spielen, scherzen dir um Wang und Brust, in den seinen Locken fühlen. Teilt ich mit euch diese Lust. Hin zu dir von jenen Hügeln emsig dieses Bächlein eilt, wird ihr Bild sich in dir spiegeln. Fließt zurück, dann unverweilt, fließt zurück, dann unverweilt, ja unverweilt.
As was his habit, Beethoven used this personal crisis for self-examination and for a strengthening of his resolve. But he somehow needed a focal point outside himself to relieve his loneliness and also his inevitable egotism. His nephew Karl satisfied his dormant paternal instincts. A pleasant, if somewhat feckless lad, Beethoven suddenly saw in him a reason for existence, a return of responsibility, a continuity. It was altogether too heavy a baggage for an ordinary young man to be loaded with. Beethoven engaged in a prolonged battle in the courts for the boy's custody, the opponent being Karl's mother. The boy was moved from home to home, from boarding school to private tutors, as the legal battles went from appeal to counter-appeal. And at last, Beethoven, the winner against his hated sister-in-law, whom he dubbed the Queen of the Night, tried hard to make Karl into the genius he was not. It was a fruitless struggle, but then Beethoven knew about genius and about little else. He wrote the Hammerklavier Sonata in 1817. It was the beginning of his last period of creativity, a period of the greatest exploration, all within the realms of undiscovered tonalities and musical ideas, a period of unrelieved concentration. while Carl sat at the keyboard of his piano, staring out of the window and thinking of nothing in particular. Great works followed, the last piano sonatas, the last quartets, the Missa Solemnis. This Mass was indicative of the intensity of Beethoven's mysticism as the end of his life inexorably approached. He attempted to sell his works to various publishers urgently. It was not that he needed the money, but he desperately did not want to have to sell his shares. They were for Carl's future. Everything was for Carl's future. Beethoven saw himself as a good parent, generous to a fault, forgiving as the occasion demanded, an example, a paragon of sternness and righteousness. Poor Carl had no chance under the weight of his uncle's complexes. And it was against this background that Beethoven wrote his Ninth Symphony, one of his crowning achievements, with its final hymn to joy and to brother. The Ninth Symphony was greeted with great applause. It was a glorious moment for Vienna and for Beethoven. Even though many admitted they were baffled by this hailstorm of new sounds. At the dress rehearsal, Beethoven eagerly ran through the pages of the score, stretching up for crescendos, crouching to indicate the intimate moment, throwing his arms in the air at what he imagined were the fortissimi. But the musicians of the orchestra knew better than to follow his gestures, for the poor maestro couldn't hear a single note of his great work. Though his musical ideas may have been an affront to many, Beethoven's fame spread throughout Europe. Musicians flocked to Vienna in the hope of meeting him. But for several years now, he had been communicating with visitors through a so-called conversation book. There were many of these notebooks in which his thoughts and wishes were communicated in writing. But despite this, his spirit was ever buoyant. There was for him only one antidote for his tribulations: work. Another, a 10th symphony. The deaths in Beethoven's family, together with his own infirmities, made him conscious of mortality. He was prepared for death before his time without in any way being reconciled to it. Both doctors and quacks prescribed all sorts of crazy cures for his illnesses, and he grew to loathe them all, although he obeyed their instructions. Death eventually overcame him on the 26th of March, 1827, during a fierce thunderstorm which drowned his invective, his anger. He hated the darkness of death, even more than the bitterness of life. And he would have preferred as a memorial, not the celebrated death mask, but the room of his birth, the first small spring of his dawning vitality and inspiration.